Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 51 of the Future of Work show. Now, if you've been watching us for some time, we discuss topics that are influencing ideas and topics that are influencing the way organizations are developing. And one big trend of the last 2 years has been the emphasis on wellness. So, to discuss the emphasis on wellness and what is it that you and I, as regular people, can learn to make our own professional lives and even personal lives the best that they can be, I have with me Dr. Marcus Ranney today. He's the founder of Human Edge, and he's had an extremely interesting background, which makes him perhaps one of the most ideal and unique people to speak about what does it take to really influence human performance. So, welcome, Dr. Marcus. Lovely to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on the half century.
Thank you. Thank you. That's quite a surprise, actually. When we started, we weren't sure how much interest our show would get, but yeah, we're really happy that so many people have tuned in through the several episodes to really understand, what is it that the world is moving into.
Yeah.
And wellness has been such an area of focus for the last, couple of years, ever since COVID-19. So I'm really delighted that now we finally have an opportunity to discuss wellness.
Good.
So, you've had such an interesting background. In fact, I can safely say I haven't come across many people who've done the range of things that you have, right from working with the NHS to being an expedition doctor to working with the Royal Air Force, Thrive Global. Um, I'd love to hear your views on what is it that, sort of brought you to the kind of work that you're doing today, which is wellness in organizations.
So, at the core, I am just a geek. I love biology. If I were to describe what my career trajectory has been, it's been one centered around biology. And I'm pretty fortunate that my experiences over the last 20, 25 years have, whilst it's zigzagged, has always had health and human performance at the center of that equation. The more I learn about the human body, the more excited I become, and my efforts now are really about translating that body of research, which I've had the great fortune of building up over the last couple of decades, to increasingly make it accessible to more and more people. The democratization of health, as I like to call it. So that's been my life journey and my passion. Being in a position to look back retrospectively and connect the dots, is that famous Steve Jobs valedictorian speech once said, is pretty interesting and cool. And I really don't know what happens next or next. I'm just really enjoying what I'm doing in the moment.
So, I read your book this week, Marcus, and firstly, I thought it was really interestingly organized because I really liked how you had, taken different expeditions, some of which you've been on and some of which you've watched closely, and you've interwoven them with the human body. But for our readers, many of whom may not be familiar with that, I thought I'd ask you questions around, how some of those expedition learnings can really translate to things that you and I can do differently in our daily lives. And if it's all right with you, I'd love to start with your first chapter on Everest. And I have to say that I have a particular interest because in April, me and my children are planning Everest Base Camp ourselves.
Amazing.
So would love to hear what is it that, how can we use the learnings you had from, the Everest Base Camp as well as the Everest summiting on understanding the human body?
Firstly, I'd like to obviously thank you for reading the book, and to all the folks who've supported this journey over the last 2 years. Being a best-selling author was not anything I had ever dreamed of, and the reason why I wrote the book was actually to just leave something behind to inspire my kids, as a hope that they fall in love with biology in the same way that I've fallen in love with biology. And maybe one day when they realize that their dad has got a little bit of coolness in him, they may pick it up and live through some of the stories and experiences that I had. And that was the purpose of writing the book. So I want to thank everyone that supported me over the last few years. and it's going to go into second print in the next few months. We're really, really excited about that update as well. So the journey began with Everest, and I started chapter 1 with Everest for two reasons. One is because when I looked back at the moment that I fell in love with biology at extremes, it was in the lead up to the Everest expedition. I was at med school. I was taking some time out of my medical program, and I did a second degree, which is in human physiology. And in that degree, I had the opportunity to focus on a particular area. So I chose extreme medicine and extreme physiology. What happens to the body when you push it to the limits? And at the time, serving in the Air Force and working with these incredible fighter pilots and these ultra endurance athletes and service professionals, my mind increasingly was drawn to this idea that this human frame, which we enjoy and that we frankly all become too comfortable being comfortable with, actually, when you put it in discomfort and uncomfortable environments, actually excels and adapts and becomes this incredible force of nature. And how can we then learn from that to translate it back to our day-to-day lives? So that was the journey that I was in. And the Everest expedition at that time was the first big one that I was being involved in. So I led the entire efforts to base camp. We were about 100 medical students and doctors and crew. We had over 3 tons of equipment with us, and we were testing everything from heart function to respiratory function to brain function, blood tests, ECGs, all kinds of various facets of human physiology to try and understand, honestly, frankly, what happens in a low oxygen environment. So people who have been to altitude will probably appreciate that the higher you go, the more out of breath you become. And that's not because of the physical strain. Yes, it is strenuous to walk up a hill and climb a mountain, but it's because the envelope of air that we have is getting thinner and thinner as we ascend higher and higher. And as the envelope becomes thinner, the concentration of gas molecules, and principally oxygen for us, because that's what we respire and use to create energy, becomes less dense. And so the concentration becomes less dense, so our bodies don't have enough oxygen in there. And this is interesting for us from a scientific perspective, because every day there are millions of people around the world who are combating, their bodies are combating a low oxygen environment. And that's either people in intensive care or undergoing surgery or undergoing a major chronic respiratory-like disease. And the difference is that in some people, if you turn up the oxygen settings for them, they actually do much better. But in other people, if you turn up the oxygen settings, they actually do much worse. And they start to develop acute respiratory distress syndrome. And the increase in oxygen actually negatively impacts their trajectory of health. So we set ourselves this question of trying to understand why. Why do some people do well at oxygen and some people don't do well at oxygen? And nature has provided the most incredible landscape to conduct these experiments. And it's going to high altitude and mountains. So for the last 60, 70 years, people have been doing some science, but as the technology has become more and more miniaturized and our understanding of that science has gotten better, in 2007, this big expedition from the university that I trained at, University College London, decided to do that and take hundreds of people to high altitude and measure all kinds of things around the human body to try and appreciate why this is so. And that's when I got hooked. So that's why I started this book with Everest, because it was my journey of when I fell in love with the science. And also this appreciation of oxygen really, and now that you've read the book, hopefully you can understand how it's the thread which makes its way through the various chapters, whether it's running the full marathon, whether it's going to space, whether it's diving deep in the Mariana Trench. I wanted to start with oxygen because it keeps coming back over and over again. So that's sort of why that chapter also turned out to be the first one.
So what would you say, Marcus, would be something that, we can take away from, and just as an example, say what you learned at Everest, like how can that make our own day-to-day lives more optimized, as you say, or just us live a more healthful life?
I think one of the biggest learnings is the role of oxygen and just how important it is to have a healthy, compliant cardiovascular and respiratory system. When it comes to this body was made for movement. Unfortunately, we have this word exercise, which has been thrown out in society, and A lot of people view that word exercise with a lot of anxiety, shame, or something to be really, really fearful about. So I like to talk about the reframing of exercise towards movement, whether it's to dance, whether it's cleaning around the house, whether it's taking a flight of stairs, or whether it's doing something incredible in nature, like going for a trek with your family, or going sailing, or just going for a walk or a jog. Moving the body is one of the most important things that we can do from a longevity perspective. And there's a particular band of movement which is really critical for us, and that's what we call zone 2 movement. Zone 2 movement is where your heart rate is roughly between 60 to 75% of your maximum. So for everyone listening in, if you want to calculate your maximum heart rate, it's very simple. It's 220 minus your age. So if you're 40, that's 220 minus 40, which is 180. So if you take 60% of that, 60 to 70% of that, that's your zone 2 band. And if you have a device like an Apple Watch or Fitbit or Garmin or any of those more commonly available devices, a lot of them now automatically calculate your zone 2 band for you. Yeah. And for each of us to get at least 30 to 45 minutes of zone 2 movement in a day is really, really important, because that's the zone wherein fats are burned, oxygen is consumed, we get this incredible cardiovascular respiratory benefit, but it's also very important from a metabolic health perspective. So for people who come to me who have pre-diabetes or PCOS or other forms of metabolic dyssyndrome like fatty liver, etc., one of the first things I get for them to do is start charting out to ensure that they get at least this prescription, lifestyle prescription, of 30 to 40 minutes of zone 2 moving every single day, because their weight will naturally come down as their body preferentially burns fat. Their metabolic activity will naturally go up, and they're getting the benefit of cardiovascular training as well, which is so important for the heart, the lungs, and the circulatory system as well. So the importance of oxygen and how we can use that to push our bodies, not from a high intensity perspective, but low intensity, steady cadence, long periods of time, have got a multitude of benefits from a health, performance, and longevity perspective.
So I'm going to take you to another chapter that you wrote about the marathon itself, and your experience running, I guess, must be the Tata Marathon.
Yes, last week on Sunday.
Yes, and I mean, I haven't done the full, but I've done 9 halves, so I could relate with some of what you described as your experience. So can you share a little bit about, what is it that, for instance, I know this is just one of the many things you speak about, but what is it that you learned through the experience yourself of going on a marathon and working with others who are doing this kind of, long distance training, that in some way provides insights to how, once again, you and I can live our daily lives more healthfully?
I'm so grateful that I discovered the joy of running. I was never a fit child. In fact, ironically, I detested sort of physical activity as a young boy. And even when I was applying to the Air Force, having to go through that physical exam, it's something that I really didn't enjoy, and I managed to just scrape through, and I got in, and I just did the minimal that I needed to. It was only about actually 8 years ago, last Sunday, that my wife and I, Ranney and I, we decided, you know what, we want to do something together. We had participated for a friend's charity the year previously in 2014 or so, doing the Dream Run. And we saw this incredible environment and people moving and the fun people were having while running. So we said, we're going to do it together. And the next year in 2015, I think it was, we did the half marathon together. And it was an incredible thing for us to do as a couple, to train and then finally complete it. And I wrote a little bit about that in the book as well. But since then, I've just fallen in love with this as a sport. And I've begun to appreciate the benefits it has, not just on my physical health and my performance perspective, but more importantly, the emotional and mental benefits that I get from running, and the life lessons that I have now begun to apply in different spheres, whether it's being an entrepreneur, whether it was working within a large corporation, whether it's around just being a better, more humble, and more resilient human being. And I try to bring those qualities to all the facets around me. So yes, running for me is a sport that I love doing 2, 3 times a week, and I absolutely adore the massive events like the Mumbai Full and the energy that the city brings. Especially this one was so special, 3 years of lockdown, and then finally coming together and 60,000 runners. It was just such a beautiful day for all of us. But as I said, it's more for me this. It's almost become a spiritual practice for me, where it's me on myself. I just, as you probably enjoy as well as a runner, you just get into a zone. It's you and your thoughts. You get to think through a lot of stuff that you're just working through, think about things. And, running for 3, 4, 5 hours gives you a lot of time to do a lot of deep thinking about your soul and searching around questions. So that's what I love about this sport. Yeah.
I could help but notice just the central place that the mitochondrial structures have in both your book and I think you probably are the only one who has mitochondrial, what is it, in your
Optimization link,
headline,
yeah.
right? Your LinkedIn headline as well. So I was just curious about, your interest in mitochondria, the structures around it, and just, your own learnings, which perhaps will help all of us in, how do we maintain the health of these very interesting structures within each of us.
So to all our viewers, Dr. Shalini was forewarned, because on my LinkedIn profile, I say, if you want me to talk for hours, then bring up the word mitochondria. It's something that I've been obsessed with this. It's been right from the Everest expedition days, because what we found on the Everest expedition was that as we studied what's called the oxygen cascade, which is the moment oxygen enters your mouth, makes its way down the trachea into the lungs, then goes into the circulatory system, makes its way into the heart, and pumped around the body to the cells. All of that pales in comparison in terms of adaptation to what's actually happening at the mitochondrial level. So 2 billion years ago, a single cell organism engulfed another single cell bacteria like tiny organism. And for the first time in history, and never again since that in the animal kingdom has this occurred, that the organism that was engulfed actually provided such an advantage to the host that they created this symbiotic relationship. And now, 2 billion years later, we have this mitochondria which exists within all our cells except the red blood cell and across the animal kingdom. And its principal reason for existence is the creation of this energy currency that we call ATP, so that all of our cells can do what they need to do. So if you're a beta cell in the pancreas and your role is to push insulin out, if your mitochondria isn't working and you're not creating enough mitochondria, then the beta cell doesn't do what it can do, and that's the beginning of developing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. If you're a heart cardiac myocyte and you can't contract with the same force and rhythmicity that you need to because your mitochondria aren't able to create the energy, well, that's the beginning of cardiovascular disease. So I fell in love with it because of the basic sciences around human performance, pushing the body, athletes, and that's why we even did this blood test immediately after doing the full marathon last Sunday. But increasingly, we as a body of scientists around the world and clinicians are seeing the central role that mitochondria is playing in the origin and the progression of chronic disease. And I think, and that's why I dedicated the penultimate chapter of my book to the subject as well, that I think in the next 10 to 20 years, we are increasingly going to see diagnostics, interventions, therapeutics, which are specifically focused around mitochondrial health and optimization, not just for runners and cricketers who we're currently testing for the first time in India through Human Edge and our partnership with the Indian Institute of Technology, but for all of us, whether it's diabetics, whether it's people suffering from Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disorders, whether it's people who are suffering from cardiovascular diseases and heart attacks, etc. I think how we unlock the ability of mitochondria in the years and decades to come will drastically influence the trajectory of human lifespan and health span as well.
So tell us, how do we improve our mitochondrial health?
So there are many things that one can do. The basic philosophy and premise around this little organelle is that it loves being stressed in short amounts. So the things that are commonly becoming more trendy on social media and people talk about it, intermittent fasting, cold water immersion or cold showers, saunas and heat therapy, zone 2 and zone 5 exercise. These are all methodologies to stress the mitochondria in short bursts. And when the mitochondria is stressed in a short burst, it actually begins to change itself and optimize itself, because it sees itself as being under stress and threat, and then goes into a protective mechanism of replenishment and renewal, which is beneficial to the organism around us. All of those different stresses that I spoke about, the different what we call hormetic stress, short intensity bursts of stress, have subtly different mechanisms of action. But the ultimate goal is that we need to become comfortable being uncomfortable. That's why a cold shower, which is discomforting, actually is a benefit to us. The spending, and I spent 20 minutes in the sauna this morning after my gym session. It's really, really discomforting, but actually it has a huge host of benefits on cardiovascular health and mitochondrial health, as intermittent fasting, etc., etc. are. So these are the reasons why these tiny things can make a benefit. Now, the cellular mechanism for how is something we're still understanding and studying. Hence why we even did these blood tests for the first time. We wanted to try and see in a small group of runners who did the half marathon versus the full marathon, could we see a signal difference in mitochondrial activity in terms of which fuels they were consuming and the inflammation that they were creating and these stress responses, what we call reactive oxygen species, ROS. Is there a difference between half marathon runners and full marathon runners? Is there a difference in people who ran fast versus running slow? And then can we retrospectively look back, because we took a baseline sample before everyone went running, to see, can we begin to predict who might be a strong finisher based on what their baseline is? So it's just the very, very beginning for us, but we're really excited that the research capabilities to translate now into day-to-day living has gotten to a state that we can do these tests simply.
And I see there's a question, Shauna Kai, thank you for joining us, who's asking, are there any cures for mitochondrial diseases? I don't know if this is an area of your focus, but...
Yeah, so there is a specific group of disorders caused by genetically induced mitochondrial deficiencies. And these are disorders which either unfortunately terminate themselves while the fetus is within the womb. So it's one of the common reasons why there are either stillborns or miscarriages. And then there are some young children and newborns that are born with these conditions, but unfortunately their life expectancy is pretty short because mitochondria is just so critical from every cell's performance and capabilities perspective. So one of the areas of current scientific research is looking at DNA manipulation techniques and therapies. A lot of our viewers and listeners may have heard of CRISPR-Cas9. The person who discovered it won the Nobel Prize for Medicine 6-7 years ago. So this is one mechanism to try and alter the DNA, because inside of the mitochondria, it has its own DNA. It's called mitochondrial DNA, empty DNA. It carries 13 sets of genes. So one set of scientific research and efforts are looking at how we can potentially alter the genetic makeup within the mitochondria and for the genes that code for mitochondrial proteins and other enzymatic activities which are held within the nucleus of our cells as well. Another group of activity is looking at molecules, pharmaceutical molecules that can be given to individuals to begin to change mitochondrial activity. And folks who may follow the work of David Sinclair might be familiar with sirtuins that he speaks about a lot. People who follow the work of Nir Barzilai may be familiar with metformin, which we commonly know as a diabetic medication, but it has mechanisms of action at the mitochondrial level as well. People who are familiar with Matt Kaelin might have heard about his work that he's doing with rapamycin in dogs principally, but rapamycin also has effects on mitochondrial activity as well. So there are many molecules, and there are actually many, many more as well, but these are some of the most commonly spoken about molecules which can affect mitochondrial activity. So there's a lot of pharmaceutical efforts behind drugs that could potentially be given to people to extend mitochondrial activity. But my focus area is really about the agency of life that we have control over, which is our day-to-day living. And I speak about this pentagon, the pentagon of good health, which is sleep, movement, fueling the body, the environment, and our mood and emotion. And there are actually abilities on all 5 of these pillars that can subtly begin to influence. And we spoke a little bit about this earlier, Dr. Shalini, where intermittent fasting, right? So that falls under the fueling mechanism, or different mechanisms of recovery that falls under the sleep pillar, or different forms of movement and exercise, particularly zone 2 and zone 5, because they both are responsible for different cellular fueling pathways within the mitochondria. So the question was a really good one. And I hope I've been able to give them the appreciation that there's a different framework. There are genetic interventions, there are pharmaceutical interventions, and then there are lifestyle interventions that can be applied as well.
So just on that note, Prashant Saha, hi, thank you for joining us, asks a question. What would be your recommendation for someone who is a couch potato to start their holistic fitness journey in an organic and sustainable manner?
So that's a lovely question, and a hashtag that Raina and I came up with a few years ago. Google, get up, get out, and get moving. And it's something that we started in the pandemic, and we've continued since then. And honestly, it's just doing simple things. So Prashant asked the question. Prashant, don't think about it in terms of exercise and fitness. Think about it in terms of enjoying the machine that nature has been so incredibly fortunate in giving to us, and we get this one life to enjoy it in as much frames as we can. So learn to love moving the body. So whether it's dancing, whether it's going for a walk, whether it's playing a sport with your kids, whether it's just hanging out with your friends and playing, just doing something, just create some reason why you have to move. It could be the simple act of standing at your desk, and a lot of people through the pandemic migrated towards standing desks. It could be the simple act of taking that 2 o'clock meeting in your calendar and converting it into a walking meeting for your entire team. Switch the video off. Everybody look at your step count before the start, and whoever accrues the most number of steps through the call,
I like
at the end of the week, we
should have done a walking podcast.
There we are. Actually, I was on a podcast recording yesterday, and the host was telling me about Chris Hart, and he does this podcast in the US where he and his guests sit in an ice bath. Now, he was joking that we could have done that as an alternative, but everyone's trying to find different ways of doing podcasts.
Yeah.
And hosting. But Prashant, just move the body. It could be as simple as that short flight of stairs. So I have a little rule. If I've got to go to an office or a home and it's up to the 4th floor, I just use the staircase. I don't even bother with the lift, including in the airports. I never use the travelator. I never use the escalator. Even if I've got hand luggage, I'll just take that small flight. Because the more little ways you can just build in a little bit of movement in the day, it all stacks up, it all accrues up, and suddenly it becomes a behavior and a mindset and a lifestyle choice.
I think that was a really good answer. Marcus, tell me a little bit about now, your organization, Human Edge. I know that Human Edge works with organizations to help professionals, live their most optimized lives. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, how is it that you do this, and both how do organizations sign up for this and how do individuals sign up for this?
Yeah, it's one of those very serendipitous journeys for me being an entrepreneur. On the back of the book Success, right at the start of the pandemic, I was increasingly being invited to speak about the content about human health and performance at extremes, and this ideology about biohacking longevity and how can we create simple lifestyle interventions that can really over a period of time compound and elevate one's health and performance really significantly. And that's when the journey of Human Edge, the company, sort of sprouted from the book and its content as well. Now we're a team of 40 distributed around the world. We operate in 14 countries. We've been fortunate to work with over 50 large MNCs the world over, touching somewhere close to 30,000 individuals within those partners that we have. And the act is about uniting one's biology and technology. So one of the key challenges that I set out to address with Human Edge was the appreciation that well-being can be customized to the organization, but it needs to be personalized to the individual. We cannot have a templatized approach anymore. We can't just push steady state content out or have one coach for the entire organization and expect the same level of engagement and impact, because frankly, all of us are uniquely biological beings. Our physiology and our psychology, the operating system, is fundamentally different for all of us. So we live in a world where we're creating data. 2 megabytes of data is created every second by every single one of us listening to this podcast. It's coming from the devices that we wear, like these rings and these watches, from the technologies, from our phones. But all of this information that we create is being used to either recommend something we shouldn't watch, or eat something we shouldn't eat, or date someone we shouldn't date, etc., etc. So I thought, well, can't we use that data intelligence to actually improve the health index of organizations and templatize it, customize it, but personalize it to the individual. So that's what we started to address. So our technology layer goes into an organization and we begin to collect information. It could be blood data, because a lot of people undergo executive blood checks every year. It could be wearable data. Of the 1 billion white collar workers that were there in 2020 at the start of the pandemic, and unfortunately this is the most recent data stat that I have, a third of them already owned and wore a wearable device. I see one on your wrist. I've got 2 here and well. So wearable information and wearable data is the second set. And even with people who don't have a wearable device, we constructed a lifestyle survey instrument tool that we can begin to understand an individual's choice, habits, behaviors, and patterns in order across these 5 pillars that I mentioned: sleep, fuel, movement, environment, and emotions. And the efforts are to prescribe, and I put air quotes here, lifestyle interventions, what we call biohacks, to people every day based on their goal, their objective, their current status, and what's happening around them. If they're traveling suddenly, then biohacks need to change. If they have become a new parent, then biohacks need to change. If they are suffering from an acute illness, then biohacks need to change. So that's what we've been doing. It's bringing together the world of biology and technology, customizing but personalizing, and really allowing people to start this journey of compounding change over a period of time through simple lifestyle interventions. Because as a clinician, I fell out of love with sick care and pathogenesis very early on in my career. I've always been someone who's just loved the ability to optimize and uplift and elevate, whether it's a physical feat, whether it's a mental, whether it's emotional feat, at work, at home, or at play. And so Human Edge is that partner that allows us to do that within organizations.
Can you give an example, Marcus? So, what would personalization look like? It's a little bit easier for me to understand from, say different people have different fitness levels, and therefore the recommended exercise would be different. But what about some of the other things you spoke about, say sleep, for example? How
Sure.
would sleep recommendations be personalized? How does that happen?
Sure, that's a great area because it's the first pillar that we always start with, because it's fundamental to health and performance. So we've built a library of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these biohacks that we've constructed over the last few years. So let's look at sleep, right? So there are different data points that we can collect on an individual sleep, and we roughly divide these into inputs and outcomes. An input might be something like the number of hours that you slept last night, which we can either collect by asking you the simple question: did you get the 7 hours of recommended sleep last night? If you have a wearable device, then we can automatically download and collect that data, which is much more scientifically valuable for us as well. So those are sort of inputs that we get into the system. And then outcomes are the question around, but did you wake up feeling refreshed and energized this morning, right? So 2 people may have slept the same volume of time, but the outcome at the end of the morning, when they wake up in the morning, could be fundamentally different. And that could be different because of different things. Either the quality of sleep was different, deep versus REM sleep, something that we get from the wearable devices. The amount of disturbance that they may have had during that night might have been different. They may have had something really anxious that's just been ruminating and playing on their thoughts. So we collect these different information from data, from questions, from our coaches, etc. And then our job, or the intelligence that we built now, is to then start prescribing. So if we look at the biohacks around sleep, I'll mention maybe 3 or 4 which our listeners might be able to get some benefit from. So we look at the environment in which you sleep. So the optimal temperature that the human body rests and get its most restorative period of sleep is between 18 to 19 degrees Celsius. For people joining us from the other side of the pond and thinking in Fahrenheit, that's 60 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So adjusting the temperature in your room is one of the most powerful things that someone can do in order to get into deep sleep. So if we're able to look at your sleep data and I can immediately see your sleep efficiency and the amount of time that you spent in deep sleep wasn't up to 25%, then that's something we can very specifically do around temperature control. Another thing which is very commonly used and very powerful, in fact, is magnesium. 400 milligrams of magnesium, either as magnesium citrate or magnesium glycinate, the two salts, given at 8 p.m., so roughly 2 hours before one goes to bed at night, is one of the most powerful things that you can do to rest the body. Magnesium has got a role to play in emotional health. It can actually bring anxiety down. It's very powerful from an immunity perspective. It boosts immunity as well. But it is really, really powerful when it comes to rest and recovery as well. So magnesium, 400 milligrams, temperature control. Then as we study the routine of an individual and we begin to appreciate their bedtime routine, we can begin to make changes there as well, right? One of the other easy things we do is we ask people to swap half of the lights in their living room to 50% wattage to the other bulbs. So after 7 p.m., you switch your lights to 50% wattage. That allows the melatonin levels in your bloodstream to increase over that period of time, because that's the hormone that your body requires in order for you to begin to go to bed. And it is suppressed when you have light, and that's why these screens are so dangerous for us as well. So changing the light or the luminescence in your environment around you is another thing. Another thing we could use is the yellow lenses. Some people who've seen me do lives late in the evening, and I keep it right behind me here, are that I'll put these on because the yellow lens is a polarization lens that blocks the blue light that gets emitted from the screens. And so if I'm ever doing a late night call or a late night live, then I'll make sure I put these on so that my melatonin levels can be as high as they can. So there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these different biohacks, and the personalization gets prescribed based on the cause for why that individual is either not sleeping the right volume, the right quality, the right environment, or they're not feeling that energized, energetic, vital self when they wake up. So the question set and the data set then dictate the biohacks which are being suggested for people at the other end.
I think that was really helpful, Marcus, and I can really understand that, because I also track my sleep data. As you notice, this is it's a garment. Probably you also are wearing a garment, and you know that you get sleep data across different, deep sleep, REM, light sleep, and the Garmin gives you a body battery indication in the morning. That's actually quite interesting and helpful in sort of seeing whether your own personal experience of vitality matches the reading that you get on your wearables. So I think that's really very, very, very helpful. I like your suggestions as well for very practical things that one can do for better sleep, right from temperature to light to the kind of light that you're surrounded with. So moving on to something that I've been curious about. You work in the wellness space, and I know that uh, for the first time, perhaps in all the years that I've been working for CHROs, wellness has moved in the top 3 of their priorities for the year. So I'd love to hear from you what you've been experiencing as you work with organizations. Uh, and I'd also love your thoughts around, one dilemma that people working in organizations have faced over the last couple of years, which is that on the one hand, the emphasis of wellness is higher than ever. but this is at the same time when rates of burnout are higher than ever as well. So that's a second question, and I'd love your thoughts on both.
I think the pandemic changed the way we view important things in our lives, right? The World Economic Forum termed it as the biggest psychological experiment ever conducted, where at the same time the entire world was inflicted with the same challenge. And it's something which is very unique to the people who are alive today, because it's something that we will always share as a common experience for all of us for the rest of our lives as well. The grand realization is the way I sort of term this, which is the grand realization of health and wellness as being a strategic, important parameter in our lives, because we were challenged individually, we were challenged organizationally, and we were challenged systemically as well. And we must all be under no illusions that this has gone away or will not come back. Now, the COVID pandemic may not hopefully return in its avatar that we experienced. But the cause of COVID, because of the rapidly accelerating crisis around climate, the conflict between man and the natural world, is something which is just accelerating at a more and more rapid pace. And we're seeing that every year for more and more periods of time through the year as well. So our generation and the generations to come are going to face increasingly big stressors on our health directly because of what's happening to us from the world around us. Right? I live in Mumbai. I moved here 13 years ago. I have never experienced an air quality index of what I've experienced living here in the last 3-4 weeks. 551 was the highest AQI that I saw on my phone. And now I've read and seen this happen to our friends and colleagues in North India. And I know the folks there suffer with this every single year. And we've always thought, oh, this will never happen to our part of the world because we have the sea coastal air, etc. But it did happen, right? And this is just going to be something which more and more of us are going to have to come to terms with. So health as a priority within our lives, individually, organizationally, and systemically, is something which has just elevated itself to its highest level. In addition to that, apart from the physical manifestation of what's going on in our health and the physical lives from a disease perspective, as you rightly said, we're also now living in times where burnout, and it was so sad to listen to the New Zealand Prime Minister yesterday evening give a resignation. And she has been one of the most empathetic global leaders.
Yeah.
Phenomenal, right? And I wish we had more leaders like that. And for her to say that she has to leave not because of any other reason, but because of burnout. I mean, how sad is that for the global community? And New Zealand has really led the charge from a well-being perspective in so many of her policy decision making. It's just so sad to see, but it's everywhere. CEOs, individual employees, entrepreneurs, corporate athletes, as we call them, all of us are afflicted by burnout. And something that again that I say is that 1 in 1 of us get affected with a mental or emotional challenge now. It used to be 1 in 3 before the start of the pandemic, but all of us have faced something, and that this is causing an effect. And it is translating in terms of attrition rates. It's translating in terms of disengagement. It's translating in terms of sick cares. I mean, there are really many compounding and complex things that are happening in the workspace because of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many of our colleagues who work in the HR fraternity, the learning and development fraternity, chief wellness officers, something that were probably unheard of 5-6 years ago. Now most of our client partners have them, right? So that's incredible to see. But we're just scratching the surface now. I think as prioritization increases, yesterday, in fact, I got an email from a CHRO in Europe, and he wrote to me very specifically asking about how we can tie these activities into their ESG frameworks in terms of environmental sustainability and governance, wherein health now is critical for ESG, not just in terms of reporting employee health and wellness, but the lens we were looking at it is that if I can get my workforce moving more steps, more movement, step challenges, the types of things that we might do, then can I translate that into a carbon offset number? Because now more people are walking to work or less, or using less of their cars, etc. Right? So that was a really interesting connection between health and environment. And because we collect so much data on people individual data and their commuting data and their environment data, can we be in a position to connect the dots for them and be able to then provide them to report something back to their stakeholders and their shareholders as well? So I think it's going to be a really, really fascinating time because biology and technology are coming together. The world framework for how we view this lens at work, at home, and at play has been changing. Budgets are increasing, expanding, but at the same time, our nuances around them are also becoming more finicky. So that will push the envelope from a product perspective, right? People are expecting more of their products. People are expecting more of their service providers and the vendors that they work with. People are hoping that insurance and diagnostics and wellness and EAP all come together and can start to create something more consolidated, comprehensive, and holistic for the end individual and the employee. So we're going to see some really, really interesting partnerships, consolidation, and disruption happening in this space as well over the next 3 to 5 years.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, that sort of matches a lot of what we've found as well in the research that we do as Uncube. That on the one hand, the emphasis on wellness, from a corporate function perspective has never been higher. And at the same time, people are concerned. They are concerned about how work fits into their larger lives. They are concerned about the impact of work stress and burnout on everything else that's going on in their lives at far higher rates than even a couple of years ago. I think it's very welcome that the conversation around some of these topics that was perhaps taboo, just a few years ago, where if you spoke about stress being, an issue, you may not be considered as strong as someone else who didn't speak about it. Some of those barriers have been broken, and the New Zealand Prime Minister's, I would say, very brave move to, just acknowledge that the reason why she's moving on is burnout, is an indication of how culturally some of these conversations have shifted over the last couple of years. So I do think we are on to new beginnings. I also agree with you that I think we are also headed for times that are far more stressful than anything that we've seen, at least in the recent past. And therefore, for each of us to have to focus on, to find ways to focus on our own personal health and well-being, shifts to perhaps the top few priorities for each of us. So that makes a lot of sense. And thank you so much, Marcus, for coming on the show. But before we end, any last words for those who've joined us? What is it that people can, must remember from this conversation?
Wow. Let health be simple and everyday. I think there is so much anxiety and apprehension and fear around seeing your doctor, getting tested, doing things, etc., etc. And I just want to hopefully convey this message to everyone that this body is beautiful. It's amazing and it can do incredible things. And all we need to do is embrace small changes in our lives, and really they can have a powerful effect in the long run. So let health be an everyday thing for you, and just enjoy your body whilst we have it. We've been given this incredible gift.
Great note to end our conversation on. The simple things, everyday life, integrate the two. And thank you so much, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's it for the end of our episode today. Thank you for joining us, and do stay tuned for many more conversations around where the world of work is headed. Thanks from all of us at Uncube.